Okay, thank you, Dean Taifa. Welcome everyone to Decolonizing the South. Today's Decolonizing the South panel is being organized by the employees of an institution of higher learning located in a space where Native American communities have lived and worked for thousands of years. We especially acknowledge the Catawba and Cherokee who were associated with this space during the colonial era. We also honor with gratitude the enslaved Africans who labored to lay the physical foundation of the college and have contributed to its development for 166 years. As a result, we as a college community commit to actively engage in learning how to be better caretakers of this place and to continue honoring the historically enslaved persons and their descendants, as well as Indigenous peoples past and present. And I'll hand it over to Dr. Williams.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending today's event. My name is Dr. Nancy Williams, and I'm Chair and Associate Professor of the Philosophy Department. And I'm happy to welcome you to the first event of Wofford's inaugural Indigenous Peoples Heritage Month. None of this would have been possible without the steadfast leadership of the folks at the Office of Diversity and Inclusion and the generous support from the Cultural Affairs Committee. I also want to thank the members of this subcommittee, Sissy Fowler, Jordan Miller, Nadia Glover, Mackenzie Clinch, Madeline McNitch, Substantian Sisk, and Gunnar Johnson. It has been a real joy to work with all of you. We hope this discussion brings greater awareness and appreciation of some of the contemporary issues associated with Indigenous people in the region. In particular, this panel discussion will examine what decolonization means and what it might look like in the context of intersectional realities, including but not limited to gender, race, sexuality, religion, and spirituality, and ecosystems. So let's take what we learned tonight as a springboard for positive action and deeper self-reflection. At the end of the discussion, we will have time for Q&A. We ask that you post your questions in the chat option. I will be moderating the questions, so please send them to me using the privacy function. Again, I want to thank all of you and our panelists for coming to tonight's discussion. We are so glad that you're here. I now turn to our co-moderators, Isaiah Franco and Ron Robinson.
Hello, everyone. I guess I can go ahead and introduce myself first. My name is Isaiah Franco. I am a sophomore here at Wofford. I am planning on double majoring in Spanish and International Affairs with a minor in Environmental Studies. I also serve as a student coordinator in the Office of Diversity and Inclusion. And I'm just really excited to learn from these panelists and go ahead and get into the discussion.
Great, and I'm Ron Robinson, college chaplain and professor of religion. Really excited. I look down, I see 111 participants, and that's thrilling. I grew up next to the Qualla boundary in North Carolina, and so living with Native Americans all of my life, this has had a special place in my heart. And I also spent 9 summers working on the Cheyenne River Reservation in South Dakota. So I'm thrilled that Wofford's finally having a Native American Awareness Month. So thanks to all of you who put this together.
Awesome. And with that, I can go ahead and direct the first question towards the panelists. So it'll be, this is just a chance for you to introduce yourselves, but also, can you tell us a little bit about yourselves and what decolonizing means to you? You can take about 3 minutes to answer, and yeah, y'all go right ahead and do it.
So I'm Dr. Brooke Bauer. I teach at the University of South Carolina, Lancaster. I normally teach courses on Native American history, women's history, U.S. history, and Indigenous material culture. I am also a citizen of the Catawba Indian Nation, which is about 20 minutes south of Charlotte, North Carolina. So I am currently working on a manuscript. I'm finishing it up. And so I'm coming to you from Philadelphia, which is the land of the Lenni Lenape, or who we commonly know as the Delaware Indians. So what does decolonization mean to me? In basic terms, it means understanding ourselves through our ancestors who came before this modern period. So reclaiming our indigenous knowledge, who we were, who we are today. Now that doesn't mean that I'm not still going to go to the grocery store or out to the mall and buy what I need. But it just means renewing, revitalization of former knowledge that it hasn't been erased, but it has been hidden. And so that, to me, that's the kind of resistance that I think of in terms of colonization, at least for myself.
Hey y'all, my name is Jasmine Cummings, and I am an advocate, activist, and consultant. My main space, I'm based out of Atlanta, Georgia, but I'm tied to North Carolina, Virginia, DC, Maryland, and Tennessee. So I do a lot of work in the Southeast region. And I am Black and Indigenous, specifically Cherokee, Geechee, and Blackfoot. To me, decolonizing means first defining truly what colonization is. And that means, to me, violence and oppression, and putting those words to the actual realizations and lived experiences. And then it's applying that to what we consider social constructs and social norms, and how we navigate the current oppression.
Hey everybody, Shio Ganali, Holiday Simmons, Dakwa Shi Salagi, Ale, Black folks from the Mississippi Delta, Uwechi, John Simmons, and Mary Dot Simmons. Ski for having me. Hey family, my name is Holiday Simmons. I come from Cherokee people and Black folks from the Mississippi Delta. I'm the child of Mary Dot Simmons and John Simmons. I currently make my home in Atlanta, the former Muskogee Creek territories. And thank you so much for having me. I am a wellness practitioner. I have a somatics coaching practice called Southern Soul Wellness. And I also am an avid soccer player and love football. And I love being in the active practice of decolonization and what that means to me. It means a lot. So I made a few notes. It's kind of exhaustive. It can be exhaustive. And so I think it's an ever defining term that we couldn't ever possibly finish defining. But it's a response to the erasure, extraction, and exploitation of Indigenous peoples and ways. And in that way, it's an examination and a return to these Indigenous ways and practices in the face of the insertion of white supremacy. The term itself has a symbiotic relationship to colonization. I appreciated the panelists who said we have to first also look at colonization. And things that are in the spirit of decolonization now have special names like organic, like transformative justice, like collective decision-making, like cooperative economics. These are terms we use that define traditional indigenous ways. And now to do those things, we consider it decolonizing because it's in light of the colonized world that we live in. The last thing I'll say is that decolonization is not a destination, but a practice. It is both an inexhaustive list of actions and a way of being. It is the act of re-examining and either continuing or redoing everything from how you speak to what you speak, how you think of yourself in the spectrum of humanity to how you interact with others. It is reclaiming, remembering, and forgiving. It is holding the line, setting a hard boundary, and resisting. It is as much about the doing as it is about the listening.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Melinda Lowry. I am currently in Durham, North Carolina, also the lands of the Occaneechi-Saponi and related communities, ancestral communities, including some of my own ancestors. I'm a citizen of the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina. I was born in Robeson County, our sort of headquarters, and was raised in Durham, North Carolina. I'm the grandchild of Foy and Bloss Cummings and Wayne and Lucy Maynor. I also teach at UNC Chapel Hill. I'm a professor in the history department, and I direct the Center for the Study of the American South. I'm very, very honored and pleased to be here with y'all today and excited that we have so many folks in the meeting. I'm also a documentary filmmaker and actually have been doing that longer than I've been a historian. So I make films about Native American issues, identity, also aspects of Southern culture that sometimes go unexamined or over stereotyped. I think of decolonization as echoing what many of you have said. Holiday, your point about it being a process, not a destination, is something that's deeply powerful, just as colonialism is a process, not an event. It's a structuring force. Decolonization can also be a structuring force in our society. And I want to quote something that some graduate students in our history department, Brooke is an alumni of our history department as well at UNC Chapel Hill. And I want to quote something that they've recently written about decolonization in the classroom. They talked about it as not as the removal or reversal of colonialism in the classroom, but as the project of creating an academic environment in which students learn to interrogate power structures, listen to different voices as they strengthen their own, and value community engagement. A decolonizing classroom balances dissent, disruption, and critique with hope, care, and vulnerability. And as I think about their working definition, as they're trying to bring this awareness to their classmates and to their faculty, to us as faculty members, I think what they're doing is they're centering self-examination and academic inquiry. And so as we decolonize our classrooms or decolonize our university spaces, I'm especially invested in a structuring force of knowledge that, as Brooke says, places Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous ways of knowing, especially those held by our ancestors, at the forefront as leading the inquiry rather than following after the inquiry or diminished as something other than the central feature, defining feature of the inquiry. And certainly in the Indigenous worlds that many of us grew up in, critique, disruption, self-examination, all of these qualities of research are profoundly important to Native communities. And Native communities practice them perhaps better than anyone else. We seem to have to teach people to practice inquiry in Western European traditions, but in Native traditions that begins at the very moment of birth. When you belong to those communities and you center yourself in the knowledge of your ancestors and how it's been passed down, you're constantly engaged, I think, in decolonizing, certainly in decolonizing education. So amidst the many other things that it is, I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. The next question we'd like to explore is what would a decolonized South look like or feel like? And thinking about what you just said about dissent and critique, I'm also when allies are thinking about decolonization, it's easy to go to a place of romanticizing Native culture. And I'd like for you to also address that, if you would, as you talk about decolonizing the South and dealing with Indigenous cultures. And if no one speaks up, I'll call on you. So.
I can go ahead and
Yeah.
start off. For me, you know, I've probably like the rest of the panelists, I've grown up in the South, and I've seen or been subject to some type of form or forms of racism, discrimination, sexism, and other forms throughout my life. My first introduction to this was as a child at the age of 9. Let me take that back. It was age 8. So I had started a new school, a new elementary school, and everyone knew I was different from them, basically because of my skin color. And the other students, you know, kids, they're kids. But this was at the time that a land claim settlement was going on between the Catawba Indian Nation and the state of South Carolina. And a lot of our neighbors, our non-Indian neighbors, were really concerned about losing their property. Homeowners couldn't sell their homes. They were held up because of this lawsuit. So this kind of anxiety trickled down to their children, and they heard their parents call Catawbas all these derogatory names. And of course, they brought that onto the playground. They brought the physical abuse onto the playground. And so that was my first introduction. I can remember going home and asking my mom what it meant to be a half-breed, not understanding that that was probably one of the top worst words to be called as a Native person. So for me, you know, like Holiday and Melinda mentioned, there are so many forms or elements to decolonization that if I was to say one thing, is that Catawba children didn't have to face this same type of racism and discrimination that I had to face. Just recently, within the past 2 years, two female high school Catawba girls were asked to write an essay in support of Indian removal. Why was it good? And the teacher couldn't understand what position he had put these young girls in having to argue for something that they knew was a terrible event for Native people. So that for me is really important, is just the protection of our children.
It's very moving. Thank you. Jasmine?
I want to make sure. Okay, can y'all hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, I had to mute and unmute. Sorry about that. So to me, a decolonized South looks a lot like reparations. And there is so much acknowledgement that needs to happen, and quite a bit of humility that needs to come into place, as well as understanding and education. I've seen how scare tactics and propaganda can really run rampant. And I feel like Brooke touched on that a little bit, right? Like how that trickles down. And so there's this constant misunderstanding and miseducation that cycles itself generation after generation after generation. And here we are in 2020, still having to explain why we feel entitled and why we want recognition. And so to me, the decolonizing of the South looks a lot like not having to continuously fight that same battle, but to be acknowledged and to be recognized, and for the conversation to be less about equality and more about equity. Yeah, I think I want to stop there.
Okay. Thank you.
I can jump in.
Yeah, thank you.
I think that starting from intra-community to folks outside of our communities, speaking as a Black and an Indigenous person, the South is in a very unique place geographically and historically. If we look at the land, following the land, the relationship between the original caretakers of the land and the people brought here to work the land is a unique one. And that relationship looks different. The relationship between Black and Indigenous people looks different in every other region because of the imbalance of population numbers, with there being so many Black folks in the US South, and because of removal and genocide, early removal and genocide, so little numbers of Indigenous people in the Southeast. And because of the mixing between Black and Indigenous people, so many of the nations in our Eastern Seaboard and in our US South are mixed tribes. And there's a lot of history in all types. There's no singular history there. There's history of exploitation on both ends, and then there's plenty of history of both of those groups working together in the face of genocide and colonization and chattel slavery. So I think a lot of the decolonized South looks like more conversation between and healing and power building between Black and Indigenous people, between Black governance and tribal governance, between and leaders in general, between youth, and then building it out more externally. Definitely a cosign on the reparations for descendants of people, of enslaved people in the US South. I envision a federally mandated statewide package. So if you're people in Mississippi, you get a certain bit, your people in Georgia, you get a certain bit. And then building it out even more. Again, as our different tactics could be exhaustive, my ideas about a decolonized South are also exhaustive. So I'll just name two of them. And so more of a like sort of from a political policy standpoint, thinking of like reproductive justice and family planning. In this case, when I say indigenous, I mean both indigenous folks to Turtle Island or the US, but also Black folks indigeneity, that is sort of an amalgamation of Black culture as it is today, which isn't completely which doesn't start at on the US borders. You know, there's a lot of Africanisms amongst Black diasporic culture. So specifically indigeneity in that sense, so many of the ways of the South are ways that that Black and indigenous folks kept up from, and specifically in this topic around reproductive justice, from midwifery to expansive definitions of family that aren't nuclear, and the list could go on. And so I think a decolonized South could look like funding and policies that look like expansive ideas of family, expansive ways to build families, decision making around whether people want to build a family or not, and support for all of that. I also think around food justice and supporting of local sustainable agriculture. Getting back to sustainable local agricultural is an indigenous practice. It has these fancy terms now and fancy certifications. When I talked to my grandfather about it, he's like, why is there a term for that? That's what we always did. So I think, you know, we've gotten so far as to like the idea that we need more grocery stores in certain areas, but I think that that's actually only a Band-Aid, and we actually need to go back to the actual growers and not the machines that put the food on shelves. Both and. So I think those are just a few things. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Melinda?
I want to start with these ideas about place that folks have articulated, to say place is more than a specific location, say where your ancestors lived, or boundaries on a map, or an intersection or crossroads. It's all of the valences of rights and lifeways and futures that Holiday just articulated. For example, you know, when we can live in a decolonized South, I think we're living on with food that's grown by ourselves or by people that we know. It's grown, certainly it's grown within striking distance of our homes. These are foods that embrace our multicultural existence, by definition multicultural. That's also foods that embrace our ancestors from different traditions. I don't know the names of my ancestors who are of European descent, or my ancestors who came here from Africa. I'm certain I have them, but I know that I eat the foods that they ate. I know I eat the foods that they brought here. And when we can not just sort of celebrate that as something that's beautiful and romantic and nostalgic about Southern society, as if Southern society belongs in a nice little container, we can also confront some of the erasure that in those discussions. We can confront the ways in which lived experience has been marginalized in favor of wealth or in favor of extractive technologies that mean that some people must sacrifice in order so that others may prosper. And I think when we reject that, one of the premises of capitalism, one of the structuring forces of capitalism, is that some must be poor so others can be rich. Some must suffer so others can profit. And I think a lot about Beyonce at Coachella, the Homecoming album, talking about the pain. She talked about the beauty of our pain that the dancers that she was working with for that performance expressed, and not separating our lives into binaries like joy and suffering, but understanding these things as interdependent, understanding ourselves as needing to be in right relationship with each other, and defining right relationship is not something that anyone is in a position to do, except perhaps the indigenous people who are still here, very much still should be directing our political relationships in these communities. Defining right relationship is not really for anyone to say. It's something, it's work that we all have to do. So in a decolonized South, I think we're able to confront some of the things that are really difficult about the things that we most enjoy, such as food. And I've done a lot of work on Confederate monuments, for example, and the relationship of Indigenous people to Confederate commemoration. And I think that the phenomena of commemorating the Confederacy and then mourning its downfall, the downfall of the Confederacy, but then also the commemoration of it, is a profound hypocrisy that has no real place in Indigenous societies. I think if you act with that kind of hypocritical intent in Indigenous communities, you are exiled. And so as Southern communities, let's embrace all the things that make us interesting and distinct and unique, but let's also remember that hypocrisy is a form of power that is expressed without consent. And in Indigenous communities, you are not allowed, you're simply not allowed to act in a hypocritical way and still remain central to the community. So a decolonized South, I think, would begin as communities, we would be able to self-determine the values that we wished to articulate in our futures as we raise our children, and that we would also be able to pay particular deference to the social relationships and values that Indigenous people express, acknowledging fully our interrelationship with people of African descent who were brought here by force and who have their own forms of indigeneity that are equally valuable.
Thank you very much. Thoughtful responses from all of you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you all. And so I think heading into the next question, you all have really started to hit on this, and this idea of there's so many elements of life to decolonize, and it's that self-reflection that really reveals that to us. And with that being said, what dimensions of life are you all particularly interested in decolonizing? For example, gender, sexuality, ecosystems, education, foodways, like you all mentioned before, religion, spirituality, language, and just so many other elements of our contemporary lives. What would it look like to decolonize each of those dimensions for you, and what are you interested in the most? And Brooke, you can start again first if you'd like, or if somebody else wants to go ahead and
I'll
go.
be happy to. So I guess for me, one of the things that all these elements that you've mentioned, gender, sexuality, ecosystems, etc., they're all interwoven together. You can't separate one without talking about all the rest and the effects that colonialism has had on all of them. But just for the sake of time, I will talk more about language. Language, from my perspective as a Catawba, is important because, well, it's really significant to how we view our world around us. And because Catawbas are really in this space where the language is almost, it's almost not even used anymore. It's really important to me to really emphasize Catawba language. And I do this in my work where I privilege Catawba language over the English language. Mainly because, like I said, if you listen closely to Indigenous languages, you'll hear more than, say, for example, take the word chipmunk. In the Catawba language, there's not a word for chipmunk. Instead, the Catawba word for chipmunk is Dipendukduksusu, which means the beautiful one with stripes down its back. I mean, that's a visual. That's the world of Catawba people. So words are used to describe what's around them. They're not abstract words. Yeah, I mean, there's so much more to talk about in terms of this, but I think one of the first things, and I don't remember who mentioned this earlier, but one of the first things we have to do is put ourselves in the frame of mind to move from what we know as colonized to critically analyze ourselves, to ask, what are the changes that I can make? So yeah, I'll just stop there.
Yeah, thank you so much for your answer. Perhaps would I'm sorry, Jasmine, would you like to go ahead and go next?
Yeah, thank you. So, yeah, as it was stated, like all of these aspects are definitely intertwined. For me specifically, I focus on like our food and our ecosystems, but I really want to, in the South, like delve into the religion and our spirituality, and especially like being in the Bible Belt and how we have traditionally demonized traditional practices and Indigenous practices. I would love to see an aspect also of community organizing really come into play in folks' spiritual and religious homes and their church homes, and really start to address like the dismantling of the oppressions that have happened because of the influence of colonization in the Bible Belt and in our spiritual homes, and how that then gets applied to our gender roles and the expectations of what is morally acceptable, especially when it comes to our sexuality and the way that we grow our families and the way that we interact with ourselves individually. I also think that about like how especially right now, being in such I'm losing my words, but being during a time of such intense politics, I think is probably the words I'm going to use, that like how I've really realized like how the Bible Belt and like the spiritual homes and the churches have really been active participants in influence and, you know, how folks vote and the policies that are then built out from there. And I just think that there's a lot of lack of reflection on how much colonization has really impacted the current decisions that are made politically, that are encouraged by the religious leaders and organizations. And, you know, that's speaking as someone who was raised Baptist and surrounded by this, you know, fire and brimstone type pastors. So I think that being able to start to, again, apply traditional practices and also really understanding and studying how colonization really took what we hold and value as spiritual beings, and how demonizing that and how taking that away from folks really plays into dehumanizing Indigenous folks and Black folks.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing all of that. Yeah, would you like to take it on next, Holiday?
Sure, thanks, Isaiah. Let's see. You know, I never responded to Ron's question about romanticization of the concept of decolonization. To that end, I'll just say that decolonization is for everyone. It just depends on, you know, where on the spectrum of colonized and colonizing you are, and most all of us have both of those in our histories and in our experiences of being colonized and also recapitulating colonization. So it's just like anti-racism is more for white people than it is for people of color. You know, it's, you know, dismantling sexism is actually more about men and masculine people than it is about women and femmes, or at least that's where the work should be. So similarly, I think that, yeah, finding out when, if you're a white person, finding out when what your family gave up to be white, what customs, practices, languages, names, traditions you gave up to be not that whiteness is a monolith, but be the term that we now use to become white versus Irish American or Jewish or Italian or et cetera. And so that part. In terms of, so the ways that I'm mostly in practice of decolonizing, besides all the, you know, daily personal things, the things I spend most of my work on is my practice, Southern Soul Wellness, is I actually use the term decolonizing in my practice, and I use it because it has taken a lot of work to create a holistic mental health and spiritual wellness practice, both of those things. I was trained as a psychotherapist, and I found a lot to be desired in all of the psych medicines, both for myself as a person who has been a therapist for a long time, and then as well as a practitioner. And I also had a lot of things left to be desired about its role, the standard Western mental health role within the larger, what we'll call the medical industrial complex. So the way insurance plays into appointments and coding and the diagnostic statistics manual, Lord have mercy, and all of this. And so at the same time, I was raised in a healing family. I come from a line of healers, and have always been close to what we can colloquially call people in the woo world. So curanderas, root doctors, medicine women, medicine shamans, indigenous healers of all sorts, of both the indigenous to Turtle Island and Black variety, the Orisha, etc. And so I found that in developing my practice that there was a split between actually the third world, which I was less a part of growing up, but as someone mentioned, the faith-based world. And so where I was finding a Venn diagram amongst all these worlds, and what I try to create my practice is around the specificity of building with someone, a professional who holds your story in confidence and who you can talk to. So a little bit of the talk therapy psych model, but that also with as a somatics practitioner. Somatics is it's a healing modality related to the body and where trauma is stored in the body. And so bringing that in sort of speaks to the full embodiment aspect that a lot of the massage therapists and Reiki practitioners and energy workers that I work with and have grown up with were practicing, plus the spirit aspect that you get from a lot of faith-based ceremonies and practices. So music is incorporated, movement, dance. And so my practice is, I think, my greatest sort of ongoing large decolonizing lift where, I'm trying to create an integrated space for people who would not otherwise either go to a therapist or not with consent or not enjoyably. So yeah, I'll use that as my wellness example.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
I'll just maybe talk about two things quickly. One I know more about and one I'm really just learning about. So I'll start with the thing I'm really just learning about, which has to do with decolonization and climate change. I've heard a number of Indigenous scholars, people like Zoe Todd, who's an anthropologist, but also healers or community organic intellectuals, as Vine Deloria called them, folks who, have every bit of knowledge required to earn a PhD and have a prestigious career at a university, but either don't have the access or don't care for the institutional access. So those folks, when I think about the things I've been hearing from them recently, but also over years, people like John Trudell also talked about these ideas. The idea that we are here to save the planet is hubris. It's prideful language. I heard John Trudell say in about 1996 or so, 2006 or so, that Mother Earth will wipe us out before we wipe her out. And so resolving some of the issues around climate change from both a scientific perspective, but also a social, political perspective, have to do with restoring humane relationships between members of the human species in order to primarily preserve ourselves. And so that's the area in which I think I'm thinking about a lot now. And as I listen to and watch flood events in inland areas that have nothing traditional to do with hurricane effects, I look at where those flood events are taking the greatest toll on people. And of course, they're in indigenous communities in places like where we're from in southeastern North Carolina. And while folks there are striving to live in right relationship to one another in order to preserve our species, policies around them, policies enacted by governments, but even policies pursued by progressive political actors that wish to preserve certain kinds of ecologies are doing harm to those indigenous communities. There's at least doing harm by not consulting them as these policies are created, not making those communities central to the creation of policy. So that's something I'm learning more about. And then I think the thing that I know more about that I've spent a long time thinking about is education. And what it looks like even for my 13-year-old daughter who's in 7th grade to think about a decolonized classroom experience. For her, that means not just me asking the art teacher to refer to a dream catcher as part of a tradition of a specific tribal community that's not here in North Carolina, but to acknowledge that she is borrowing or that she has acquired this information, perhaps without permission, or whichever, pick your own layer of this conversation about stereotypes and Native people in public education, any kind of education. Then it's not just me challenging the art teacher on that on behalf of my own daughter. It's also other parents recognizing that their children are actively harmed by misinformation, and that their children are actively harmed when they are not told the truth about who a tradition belongs to, what that tradition means in that Indigenous language, for example, especially when boundaries are fully respected and people are consulted about what knowledge they wish to share. That process of education in a formal setting doesn't exclude Native people from the conversation. It welcomes us in a respectful way. And right now, much of what I see, not just in the work that I have to do for my middle schooler, but also in the work I don't see others doing, is knowing even the basic 101 of how to enter a conversation with Indigenous people about their knowledge in a respectful way. And so consulting us, when I make it known, for example, that Lydia is a Lumbee Indian and that I am a Lumbee Indian, and Lydia's ancestors didn't used to be Lumbee Indians, or that Lydia is not part Lumbee, Lydia is Lumbee because she has Lumbee family. These are things that I don't feel that I should have to engage in a formal educational setting. I feel like if our teachers are not given the tools, the time, the pay, the way of doing the reflection work that they desperately want to do in order to teach students in a way that values and respects their diversity, we are not going to be able to successfully see ourselves in each other. And I think that the ultimate sort of process of healing that everyone's talked about so far is a decolonized process of recognizing myself in you and you in myself. We can't do that in a classroom if teachers especially are struggling to just have the basics in order to do the most important job that they want desperately to do. And so being able to engage in a kind of decolonized process is to value the people who are most proximate to, in this case, a kind of conflict. And for me, that's teachers, it's parents also, but it's students, but teachers are in that critical role, and their input, their needs must be valued if we're going to achieve the stated goals around respect and diversity that we all say we want.
Thank you very much for these responses. They're outstanding. And a couple of things just quickly jumped out to me. One is, and I think we know this, but we sometimes don't articulate it, is we're dealing with an issue that Indigenous people didn't start, and to expect Indigenous people to solve it is not fair. And that's something that we would be wise to look toward. I also appreciate what several of you have said about policies. And I think of Ibram Kendi's work on anti-racism, and he talks about the importance of having policies that deal with this. You have policy, we talk about policies, we don't necessarily have them. You have a practice, each of you, that you're part of in your profession. And you've talked about that. I think we're at a place where we would be wise to open up for questions now. And Dr. Williams, I think you're going to lead us through that.
Yeah, if you have any questions, please send those my way. I'd be happy to share them. Give you some time to maybe type up some of your questions you might have. I don't have any just yet.
As people are formulating those, maybe some of the panelists would tell us even more about your work and how that's directly impacting the region, the community you're in.
I mentioned a little bit about my research. It's a focus on Catawba Indian women from 1540 to 1840, and I focus on such a long period of time to show the tension between change and continuity. It's necessary to really see that in women's lives and how they responded to all the transformation taking place in their world, but also how, as they responded, they are like front and center in nation building for Catawbas. Because without these women, you wouldn't have had Catawba children. Because that's how Catawbas identified themselves at the time. They traced their lineage through the female line. So in other words, I'm Catawba because my mother is Catawba, because her mother is Catawba and her mother is Catawba. And that's the way that it worked then. And so my work contributes to Southern history, South Carolina history, just to open up this hidden part of the histories of those spaces, but also of the development of America and how these women were also creating a nation out of many communities.
If it's okay, if I could just interject, I do have one question that has been submitted. If it's okay, I know we're almost out of time. Would it be okay for this one question?
Please.
All right. Okay, very good. The question is, what role could Wofford students play in being an ally in this important work?
I
I'll
can
just
jump in.
quickly-
Oh, please, by all means.
No, well, just quickly, I think I would say the first step is to know that you can't dismantle the master's house if you're still living in it. So get rid, understand white supremacy is a structuring force in your life. Understand your relationship to it. Understand how it was built, knowing the history. Dr. Robinson, you said that it's not indigenous people. People have built this system for thousands of years, hundreds of years, really, in terms of a Western European to a North and South American context. They've had every option, every alternative, every mechanism of constructing this society. The folks who benefit from it, which is all of us, I benefit from white supremacy as well. And I think about the ways constantly that I need to disentangle that understanding. I need to reevaluate it. I need to think more about the choices that I make and also what I teach and communicate to others in an authentic way in order to understand my relationship to white supremacy and how I benefit from it. So I think everybody has that work to do. If you're done with that work, if you've done it and it's over, that's fantastic. Then you can move on, as Holiday is doing, to heal some of the rest of us. But I think offering what you can to the conversation starts first with your ability to reflect on your own circumstances and to think about some of the principles of respect that are embodied in our Indigenous communities, respect and reciprocity. So understanding the history of that house, how it was built, and what you have to do with it is a critical element to moving out so that we can dismantle it.
Thank you for that. I was gonna say, learning, in addition to all of that, that's a lot of what I was gonna say. I'll just add, being, what we call being a good relative is, being responsible for, you know, reciprocity, acknowledgement, and gratitude paid for the land that you're on always. So whether you're taking a hike or sitting down to meal in an urban city, be aware of like, what's that water source? Whose land was that? How did they use it? What did they call that river there? Why was it important to them? And then slowly building that bridge between what was and then what is connecting with Indigenous people and organizations now. There's a ton of amazing groups and Instagram accounts and TikTokers and everything, Indigenous folks. The visibility is lit right now. So yeah, educate yourself, demand that certain authors and teachers be taught and invited into your classrooms. Include certain writers and thinkers and films into your curriculum. And yeah, I'll stop there. Thank you for the time.
I do have one more question, but I do want to be mindful of everyone's time. One more question.
Let's go with one more and then we'll
okay,
wrap
we do one more. Okay. The question is, hold on. This is related to the question about the romanticization of Native culture. What are some harmful pop culture stereotypes that you have seen and that allies can dismantle? I think that's part of that discussion about what allies can do. I'll be happy to repeat the question.
I'm just unmuting to say I'm going to step back while others address it.
I guess the biggest thing in being an ally is to be present and active in the many movements that are taking place across the United States related to, the many Black and Indigenous movements that are taking place across the United States. We need our allies. Each group, we need allies. Because if we don't have you as allies, then we sometimes face the accusations of, oh, they're just complaining. You know, they're not happy with where they're at and they just want attention. They should just get over it. You know, I think that's the biggest thing, the biggest comment or the most frequent comment that I've heard is, oh, you just need to get over it. We're not guilty for the past. And no, you're not. But we can't just get over it because these are processes that are continuing every single day. And if we don't stand up and ally ourselves with one another, my fear is that things will not change.
Thank you. I think that was a good word. Jordan, can you wrap us up, please?
Yeah. And I also wanted to say, as a media scholar, I think there's a lack of representation of Indigenous communities, and what little representation there is not representing Indigenous people as like whole people. So I think there's a lot of work that can be done and that is being done at Wofford and by other scholars doing that sort of work. So get in touch with us if you'd like to get involved in that sort of work too. So again, thank you. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you to the panelists. Big round of applause for your time and energy and willingness to share your knowledge with us and have this conversation. Also, thank you to our moderators, Rev Ron and Isaiah. I appreciate you all guiding this conversation. So we have this is the first of 5 Indigenous Peoples Heritage Month Committee events, so that's very exciting. One of the upcoming events is on November 12th, and I'll drop a resource list in the chat. This will be on November 12th at 11 a.m. The event is titled Uplifting Zapotec, Indigeneity and Language Revitalization in a Transnational Context. So this engages one of the points of this event is to engage people in Indigenous language. So if you want to start thinking about Zapotec language before then, we invite you to check out the Twitter hashtags that are provided on that resource sheet. One is hashtag USATUVOZ, Tuvaz, and hashtag Zapoteco Colonial, so ZAPOTECO Colonial, both of which are intentional educational communities. So the first is used by speakers and learners of mostly Indigenous languages to share their language and context, and then hashtag Zapoteco Colonial is used by Zapotec and non-native people interested in learning about colonial Zapotec texts, like the ones that we'll go through in the talk on the 12th. So if you want to know more, there's also several other resources that they shared with us. The Teacher Project is who's coming to visit. They've shared several resources that engage, there's like an online, what's it called? Talking dictionary that you can like look at, the various ways that we understand language differently and like actually hear it. And I think that's really powerful. And you can also check them out on Twitter and engage with them in the meantime. I'll put that information on the resource sheet. I think that'll be easier. So you can engage with them in Twitter in the meantime. So thank you all for coming to this event, and I hope you have a great weekend. Stay warm. Thank you all.
Thank you so much. What a wonderful evening. Thank you.
Thanks, Sissy.